In 1838, in the hot and humid Burke County, Georgia, a plantation widow named Cordelia Rutledge began a private ritual that would blur the line between medicine and murder and between sanity and insanity. You weren't supposed to hear this story. It was buried under years of silence, locked away in county records where whole pages were cut out with a razor, and only the descendants of those who saw it happen knew about it. People who knew that some truths are so bad that they poison the ground they are buried in. Willow Bend Plantation was a kingdom of cotton. It had 1,400 acres of white gold that were grown by 60 enslaved people. The main house, made of brick and columns, was in the middle of the property. It was a monument to the Rutledge family's power, which they measured in generations of dominance. Cordelia was the queen of this kingdom. She was a bride from Charleston who had moved to Willow Bend 19 years before. People said her icy gray eyes could see not only into a room, but also into a person's past, their secrets, and their family. She ran Willow Bend like a watchmaker. Every dinner party went off without a hitch, and every ledger was perfectly balanced. But Cordelia was learning a different kind of knowledge behind the mask of Southern propriety. She wasn't reading poetry or scripture by the light of a single candle late at night. She was reading medical books from Philadelphia and learning about anatomy, toxicology, and the strange, dark theories of bloodlines and inheritance. She wrote about the physical traits and hidden histories of the people she owned in her journals, not about how much cotton they produced. She was looking for a truth that her husband Thomas had gone to great lengths to hide. It was so deep and so wrong that it didn't die with him when he died. Instead, it was let loose. The official cause of Thomas Rutledge's death on March 3, 1838, was gastric fever. No one asked about it. Men like him, who ate a lot and drank whiskey at night, often died suddenly. He was 52 years old and a well-known member of the community. His funeral was a sad event for the wealthy people of Burke County. Cordelia, his wife, stood by the grave in a black silk dress that looked like a statue of grief. Her face was hidden behind a heavy veil. She didn't show any emotion. Not a single tear fell. People in the neighborhood said it was her cold Charleston upbringing and her amazing calmness. They didn't know that what they were seeing wasn't calmness, but focus. It was the calm before the storm of a predator that had been waiting for the hunt to start. As soon as the last mourner's carriage left Willow Bend, Cordelia's real work began. She didn't go back to her room to cry. She went down into the dark, damp, earthy root cellar. Inside a locked wooden chest was her real inheritance from Thomas, not the land or the money, but proof of his betrayal. There were letters, receipts for strange medical supplies, and a small black leather journal with her own spidery, obsessive handwriting in it. She read every word again for an hour, her face a mask in the dim light of a lantern. This was not a widow crying for her dead husband. This was a scientist going over her work and a general finishing up her attack plan. The plan wasn't just to mourn or even move on. It was also about making things right, getting rid of bad things, and a terrible, all-consuming kind of justice that she alone would give. She was going to be the doctor, the judge, and the executioner, all in the small area of her own plantation. 3 men were called to the main house the day after the funeral. They weren't field workers. They were the best of the best among Willow Bend's enslaved people, men whose skills made them essential. Isaiah Drummond was a master carpenter whose hands could build a barn out of a pile of wood. He could read and write, which was very rare and dangerous for a slave in Georgia. Then there was Caleb Tucker, the blacksmith. He was very strong and could bend iron to his will with fire and a hammer. He was as quiet as the metal he worked with. And last but not least, Josiah Mercer, Thomas Rutledge's personal body servant. He had grown up in the house and had been trained to be smart, observant, and completely private. He knew the master's secrets better than anyone, maybe even better than Cordelia. They were in Thomas's study, and the smell of his cigars was still in the air. Cordelia sat behind his huge mahogany desk like a queen on her throne. Her gray eyes stayed on each of them for a long time, as if she were thinking about them. She didn't think of them as men. She thought of them as parts of an equation she had made up. She told them they had been chosen for a special job, to give her a new medical treatment that she needed to stay healthy. She talked about a famous European doctor, hydrotherapy, and how she could keep her health up now that she was alone. Her voice was flat and emotionless, like a biologist talking about a dissection. They had to say yes. They didn't know what it meant to refuse, but as she talked, there was an unspoken current of knowledge between them. She looked at them for a moment too long, and in that look was a terrifying closeness. It was a look that said, "I know you, I know where you came from, and I know what's in your blood." The old people used to say that on the night Thomas Rutledge died, every clock in the main house at Willow Bend stopped at the same time. They said it wasn't a soul leaving, it was a bill coming due. The ceremony started at dawn at Turkey Creek, a slow-moving stream with cypress trees that ran along the southern edge of the plantation. The air was cold, and the mist coming up from the dark water looked like spirits. Cordelia took them to a quiet bend that was out of sight of the main house. It was a place where the world felt thin, and the rules of God and man didn't seem to matter. She had a bundle wrapped in linen. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah followed, their heads spinning with fear and confusion. What kind of treatment made the master's widow and 3 of her slaves was meet at a creek before dawn? What kind of medicine might be here? Cordelia's orders were clear, simple, and terrifyingly personal. They would all take off their clothes, get in the water together, and stay quiet. She talked like a priestess, not a mistress. She warned that any man who talked about this would be sold south to the sugar fields of Louisiana, where he would have to work hard for 5 years and then die. But the power in her eyes was almost more important than the threat. It was a power that seemed to come from a dark and specific knowledge that made them freeze before she even touched them. She took off her clothes without thinking twice, and her pale skin stood out against the dark light of dawn. She wasn't a woman in front of them. She was a tool for some horrible purpose. She stepped into the cold water with a blank look on her face and told them to make a triangle around her. Can you believe that? The fear, the shame, the horrible, surreal horror of that moment, standing naked in the cold water with the woman who owned your body, your life, and your future, as she got ready to do a ritual you couldn't understand. What happened next was a medical violation that was made to look like a sacred rite. When Cordelia opened her bundle, she found not medicine, but tools. A razor with an ivory handle, glass vials filled with clear, acrid-smelling liquids, and a small black leather book. She opened it and started to read aloud. Her voice was a low, rhythmic chant in a language they didn't know. It wasn't French or English. It sounded old and rough, like words that had been pulled up from the ground. She went up to each of them one at a time. She washed their bodies with water from the creek in a strange, methodical way. Her touch was not sexy, not even human. It was like a vet looking at sick animals. She used one of the liquids from the vials, which burned their skin with a cold fire. Next was the razor. She made a small, shallow cut on each man's left shoulder with surgical precision, right over a strange, crescent-shaped birthmark that none of them had known the others shared until that moment. She picked up the blood beads that formed on small squares of white cloth. She didn't flinch or hesitate. She mixed their blood with a chemical from a vial, which made a thick, dark paste. Then, as the sun began to break through the trees, she rubbed the mixture into her chest, stomach, and throat, while her chanting got louder and more feverish. There was silence when it was over, except for the sound of the water and their own rough breathing. "Tomorrow," she said in a whisper, "the same time." Then she got dressed and walked back to the house like she was coming back from a normal morning walk, leaving 3 broken men shivering on the banks of Turkey Creek, bound together by a secret too terrible to speak. They lost something at the creek. Not just blood, not just dignity, but something very basic, a light in the soul. There was no doubt that Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah had changed in 2 weeks. Once, these men were strong, skilled, and present. Now they went about their days like ghosts, surrounded by a thick, unseen fog. Isaiah, the brilliant carpenter, would stand for a long time staring at a piece of wood, as if he had forgotten how to join it to another piece. Caleb would let the iron cool down at the forge, his strong arms hanging down at his sides and his mind wandering. Josiah, who had been taught to meet every need in the big house, now had trouble remembering simple tasks. Their eyes were the scariest thing that changed. They looked dull and empty, as if the person behind them had gone to a deep, unreachable place. Rachel, a housekeeper who had known Josiah since they were kids, saw it the most clearly. One afternoon, she cornered him by the kitchens, her heart breaking. "Josiah, what is she doing to you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He just stared at her, his eyes looking right through her. A look of confusion crossed his face as if he was trying to remember her name. He turned and walked away without saying a word. The people who were enslaved could feel the darkness spreading. This was more than just a mean boss. This was root work, conjuring, and dark magic that came from a place that was not allowed. They said in hushed tones that Mistress Cordelia was eating them, taking their life force to give her own. They were right, but the machine wasn't magic. It was chemistry, and it didn't come from New Orleans or the Caribbean, a disgraced doctor in Charleston, and a lie that had been at the heart of Willowbend for almost 20 years. Think of the root cellar under the main house not as a place to store vegetables, but as a place where crazy people go to get their medicine. There were jars of mercury compounds and arsenic preparations on shelves next to preserved roots and dried herbs. The jars glowed faintly in the lantern light. The smell of wet dirt and chemicals filled the air, a smell of science ruined by obsession. Cordelia's kids also noticed the change in their mother. She started getting up before dawn and coming back an hour later with wet hair and a strange feverish energy in her eyes. Edmund, who was 10 years old, asked where she had gone. She told him it was for her health and that she needed to walk to clear her mind. She told him not to follow her because the morning air wasn't good for a boy like him. Of course, it was a lie, but he was too young to question it. The oldest daughter, Margaret, was 17. She was not a kid. She was smart, with her mother's sharp eyes and a growing sense of dread. Margaret saw more than just the morning walks. She saw how her mother studied Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah during the day. Her look was not that of a mistress to a slave, but of a biologist looking at a specimen in a jar. She saw the black leather book that her mother always had with her, even when she was sleeping with it under her pillow. Margaret saw her mother, a woman who had just lost her husband and was grieving, losing weight but still full of energy. It was like a cold, evil fire was burning inside of her. One morning, Margaret's fear got the better of her caution. She snuck out of the house after her mother, determined to find out where she went. But Cordelia was there, a shadow among the oaks at the end of the path to the creek. She didn't have to raise her voice. She grabbed Margaret's wrist, and her fingers felt like iron bands. "If you ever follow me again," she hissed, "if you ever tell anyone about this, I will make sure you die an old maid in this house. You will have no husband, no children, no life. Do you understand me?" Margaret was so scared of the stranger her mother had become that she could only nod and run back to the house, the ghost of her mother's touch burning on her skin. That night, Margaret wrote in her diary, her words spilling out in a frantic scrawl, "My mother is no longer my mother. A stranger has taken her place, one who walks and talks like her, but is empty inside. There is something wrong with her. She smells like burnt metal and sickness when she comes back from the creek. I don't know what she does there, but it's bad. I can feel it in the bones of this house. It's a poison, and it's spreading, and I'm afraid it will kill us all." This entry, which was found decades later, is one of the few eyewitness accounts from the family that still exist. It's a child's story about seeing her parent turn into a monster. But who could she tell? Her dad had passed away. The preacher in the area? What could she say that wouldn't sound like the crazy thoughts of a girl who is really upset? That her mother was meeting slaves at the creek for a secret ritual in the South before the Civil War. The person who made that claim would be seen as crazy, not the person it was made against, because it was so outrageous and out of the ordinary. So Margaret did what a lot of people do when they're stuck. She watched, she waited, and she wrote down the terrible things that happened in the one place she thought was safe, the pages of her secret journal. Cordelia, on the other hand, kept doing her job perfectly. She took care of the spring planting, hosted guests, and kept up the perfect image of a capable, grieving widow. But at night, when she was alone in her room, she wrote down her own version of what happened. She didn't write about her sadness or loss. She wrote about dosages and blood draws. She wrote down the steady, terrifying decline of her 3 subjects, noting their tremors, memory loss, and fading health, all with the cold, precise eye of a scientist in a lab. She was writing down how they were destroying things, and in the same entries she was celebrating how she was starting over. By May, it was clear that the 3 men's health was getting worse and couldn't be explained away as just a cold. Dr. Silas Peaton, the same doctor who signed Thomas's death certificate, saw it while he was visiting Willowbend as part of his normal duties. He was an old man whose medical knowledge was decades out of date, but he was very observant. He saw Josiah Mercer carrying firewood, and his hands were shaking so much that he could hardly hold the logs. He saw Isaiah trying to fix a porch railing, but he was moving slowly and clumsily and his eyes were not focused. He saw men who had once been strong and healthy now weak, thin, and with skin that looked sickly yellow. He told Cordelia about it, his brow furrowed with professional worry. "Is there an illness spreading among your people, Mistress Rutledge?" he asked. Cordelia was always calm and had an answer ready. "It was a recurring fever from the lands," she said, "a form of ague." She was treating them herself with quinine and calomel, which were common medicines at the time. Dr. Peaton believed her, but a small doubt grew in him. He was a careful person, and he knew that calomel treatment turned the gums a clear, blue-gray color. He had never seen a stain like that in the men's mouths. It was a small detail, a tiny inconsistency, but in the quiet, heavy air of Willowbend, it was a crack in the wall of Cordelia's lies. A week later, he told a coworker about the strange case. 2 doctors talking about symptoms over brandy, but not being able to figure out what was wrong. The poisoning was done with great care. It would have been just another medical mystery, but Dr. Peaton couldn't stop thinking about that one little thing about the calomel. Why would you lie about something so small? What was Mistress Rutledge really giving those guys? The first of the 3 men started to die, and the question stayed in the air without an answer. Think of the black leather book that Cordelia reads from by the creek. This isn't an old grimoire. It's a journal that was made just for you. The pages inside are not filled with evil writing, but with the exact scientific handwriting of a man. It's a medical protocol that gives doses of arsenic, mercury, and digitalis, with fake Latin and psychological tips on how to make someone feel helpless. It looks like a prescription for how to kill someone. In early June, the facade of normalcy at Willow Bend fell apart completely. Isaiah Drummond fell down while trying to work on the cotton gin. He didn't trip. He just fell forward as if his strings had been cut, and his body hit the hard-packed ground. He was out cold and his breathing was shallow. He was lost when they finally brought him back to life. He didn't remember his name. He didn't know the faces of the men who had worked with him for years. His speech was a jumbled mess. Marcus Diacron, the overseer, told Cordelia about it. He was a practical and cruel man. It was scary how she answered. She didn't even look at Isaiah. She said he had been drinking, which Marcus knew was not true, and told him to stay in his cabin with only bread and water. 2 days later, Caleb Tucker fell at the forge while hammering a hot piece of iron. His legs gave out under him. He was found mumbling to himself and shaking violently. Cordelia's orders were still the same, to be alone. The people who were enslaved were now in a cold, quiet fear. This wasn't a disease. This was a calling. They were getting rid of their strongest and most important men. At night, the whispers in the quarters were no longer just about root work. They were about killing someone. Dinah, an old woman who was a respected healer and remembered the old ways from Africa, knew she had to do something. She confronted Josiah and pushed a small bag of protective roots into his hand, begging him to tell her what the mistress was up to. Josiah stared at the charm like it was a strange rock, dropped it from his limp fingers into the dust, and walked away. Dinah showed great courage by going to see Marcus Delqua, the overseer. She told him that every morning the mistress was taking the men's lives at the creek. Marcus, who only believed in the whip and the ledger, laughed at her silly beliefs. He stood for a long time looking at the path that led to Turkey Creek after he told her to leave. He wasn't a good person, but he did know how to keep things in order. What was happening at Willow Bend was the slow, deliberate slide into chaos. Marcus Delqua was not a man who liked to daydream. He was paid to get the most work done for the least amount of money. Workers who were dead or unable to work were bad for business. He started to watch Cordelia, not because he was suspicious, but because he was cold and calculating. He saw her leave before dawn. He noticed that Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah would follow her in a methodical, almost ritualistic way. He also noticed something else that made him very uneasy. As the 3 men got weaker, Cordelia seemed to get stronger. The sadness of being a widow had been replaced by a strange, predatory energy. She looked younger, and the way she moved with purpose and energy felt strange. It felt like their life force was being sucked right out of them. The idea was crazy, like something out of a slave's mind, but the proof was right in front of him. So he started his own quiet search. He began to get up earlier and hide in the woods so he could see the path to the creek. He never got close enough to see the ritual itself. Some primal instinct told him that if he did, he would be a part of it. He saw the men leave and come back. They were stumbling like they were sleepwalking, but Cordelia walked with a quick, energized stride. He talked to the house staff and put together bits of information. The strange letters from Charleston that had no return address, the chemical supplies that were sent to him from an apothecary in Augusta, the 2 years Cordelia spent at a ladies' academy in Philadelphia before she got married, a school known for its progressive and, some say, radical scientific curriculum. He was putting together the pieces of a puzzle without knowing what the final picture would look like. He was aware that it was ugly. He knew it was risky and thought it might be useful because in the South before the Civil War, the secrets of the rich were worth a lot of money. Marcus Delqua was starting to realize he was sitting on a lot of money. We have to go from Georgia's hot fields to Charleston's cobblestone streets and reveal the puppet master. Dr. Victor Kensington was his name. He was a doctor, a very smart one, who had been kicked out of Philadelphia years before for doing horrible and illegal experiments on the patients of a mental hospital. He had changed his life in Charleston to become a medical consultant for the rich and powerful who were in trouble. He was an expert in what he called vital transfusion therapy, a false and very attractive idea that combined European occultism, mesmerism, and cutting-edge toxicology. He promised the rich something they were more afraid of losing than their money, their youth. He said he could move the life force, or vital energy, from a young, healthy person to an older, sick person. His clients were dying men, older socialites, and people who would do anything for a miracle. 2 years before, Cordelia had met him when she went to see her family. She went to one of his private lectures and was fascinated. This man spoke a language of science and power that fit with the dark ideas she had been developing in her own mind for years. She set up a private meeting in his office, which was filled with anatomical charts and jars of strange things that had been preserved. Finally, she told the secret that was killing her. It wasn't just a hunch. It was a fact that had grown in the quiet, dark nights of her marriage. She thought that Thomas Rutledge was not the father of her children. She also thought that he had used Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, who were slaves, to have children with her without her knowledge or consent. She thought he had drugged her and raped her through someone else to hide the shame of his own infertility and keep up the illusion of his viral Rutledge bloodline. Dr. Allen H. Robert, paraphrasing a common idea in 19th century medical ethics, said that the human mind's ability to believe what it wants to be true, even when all the evidence says otherwise, is the most powerful and dangerous force in the world. Cordelia showed Kensington her proof, the fact that her kids didn't look like Thomas, and that they shared physical traits, like the crescent-shaped birthmark, with the 3 enslaved men. The way Thomas had stayed away from her bed for years, blaming her habit of reading late at night while secretly planning this big lie. We may never know if it was true or just the elaborate fantasy of a woman stuck in a loveless marriage on a remote plantation. But Cordelia thought it was true. She was sure of her belief, and it had turned into a cold, murderous rage. She told Kensington that she didn't just want justice. She wanted to get her things back. She wanted to get back the youth, energy, and years of her life that had been taken from her and spent having children who were a constant reminder of her shame. She wanted to go back to the beginning. She wanted to drain the men who represented her husband's betrayal and take their power for herself. Kensington listened, his face showing that he understood and felt sorry for the person. He was a master predator who could tell when someone was hurt and use that to his advantage. He said it was possible. He told her that his treatments could do exactly what she wanted, but it would be hard, and she would have to do everything he said without question. He would give the directions, the chemical formulas, and the structure for the ritual. She would be his scientist who worked from a distance. It cost $5,000, which is a lot of money. Without a second thought, Cordelia agreed. She had her own money, and she was willing to spend every last cent to get her life back, even if it meant killing 3 other people. The letters from Kensington started to arrive at Willow Bend. They were plain envelopes with no return address, and the plans for murder inside. It was a great work of psychological and chemical warfare. The directions were very scary. Cordelia was to start by adding small, measured amounts of arsenic and mercury compounds to the men's food. Not yet were these meant to kill. They were meant to make them weaker, more suggestible, and more flexible in their minds and bodies. This was the time to get ready. The real treatment would start only after Thomas died. Kensington's plan for the creek ritual was pure evil genius. The early morning hour to confuse people, the cold water to shock their bodies, the forced nudity to take away their sense of self, and the chanting in a made-up language to give the event an air of mystical power and keep people from understanding what was going on. Everything was meant to break their will, tear down their sense of self, and make them believe they were going to disappear. The bloodletting was a big part of it, not for any medical reason, but because it had such a strong psychological effect. It made the transfer of life seem real and real. Cordelia thought she was taking their life force because she was so angry and desperate. In reality, she was just slowly and methodically poisoning them while doing a series of dramatic gestures that Kensington had come up with to make her feel in charge. He was playing her as well as she was playing her victims. He was using her pain and anger as part of a private long-distance clinical trial. You shouldn't know this, but there were men like Kensington who worked in the dark corners of 19th century medicine. They took advantage of rich and desperate people, using scientific language to hide their dishonest and often deadly actions. In their time, they were the shadow elites. But Kensington had a secret of his own. He was playing both sides. He was writing down everything Cordelia told him while he was sending her instructions on how to kill her. He was putting together her detailed notes on the men's decline, their weight loss, cognitive decline, and physical breakdowns into a case study that he planned to publish. It would be a groundbreaking book about his important transfusion therapy, using the Willow Bend experiment as proof. He only saw the 3 dying men as data points. Cordelia, his partner, was just another number in his equation. There was also a third person involved in this deadly game. Kensington had another person in Burke County who was paying him extra to send them copies of all the letters he sent to Cordelia. This person was also keeping an eye on her mental health because they were interested in it. This person didn't care about medicine or getting back at someone. They were interested in land, property, and the huge wealth of the Willow Bend plantation. They were waiting for Cordelia to go so far over the edge that she did something so horrible and obvious that the law would let them take control of her late husband's estate. Kensington wasn't just doing a job. He was also making a case against his own client in court. He was helping Cordelia kill herself, and at the same time, another predator was circling, ready to pick up the pieces of the Rutledge legacy. Cordelia thought she was in charge and was giving out justice that was right, even if it was bad. In reality, she was a pawn in 2 different games, with strings being pulled from Charleston and from her own county. There were enemies all around her that she couldn't see. Let's skip ahead to 1899, 60 years later. An attorney in Charleston is handling the estate of Margaret's daughter, Cordelia's niece. He comes across a trunk that is locked. There is only one letter inside that Cordelia wrote from the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in 1846. The lawyer reads it once and then burns it right away. Years later, he tells a coworker, "It wasn't the letter of a crazy woman. It was the letter of a demon who knew she was going to hell and didn't care." By July, the Georgia heat was a real thing, a heavy blanket that muffled sounds and slowed down life at Willow Bend. But the rituals at Turkey Creek didn't stop. They got worse. The heat seemed to make Cordelia's mania worse. She raised the chemical doses and kept the sessions in the creek going until the men were shaking uncontrollably, even though it was very hot. She made the ritual more cruel by making them drink bitter tinctures that made them throw up and rubbing caustic pastes on their skin that left them with sores that bled. She wasn't following the rules anymore. She was making things up as she went along, and her cruelty grew with her obsession. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah were all going to die. It was no longer a slow decline. It was a quick, terrible fall. Their skin was pulled tightly over their bones, and their eyes were deep in their skulls. They were living skeletons brought to life by the last flickering bits of a life that was slowly being snuffed out. Then Marcus Diacron, the overseer, made his move. He knew he had to do something before all 3 men died and his living proof was gone. One afternoon, while Cordelia was having guests over, he snuck into her room. It was a huge risk. If he got caught, he could be whipped or even killed. But the possible reward was too big to pass up. He went straight to her closet and found a loose floorboard that he had seen weeks before. He pulled it up, and there it was, the wooden box with a lock on it. He used a small iron bar to break the lock. His breath caught in his throat inside. Kensington's letters were all there, spelling out the whole plot in cold, scientific detail. Cordelia's journals, which she wrote by hand, list every ritual, dosage, and symptom. And the worst thing of all was a half-finished letter from Cordelia to Kensington. In it, she expressed doubt and wondered if she was a visionary doctor or just a common murderer. Marcus was too smart to take everything. He chose the letters that were most damaging, a part of the journal, and the letter that wasn't finished that showed doubt. He put the rest back, put the box back, and fixed the floorboard, leaving the room just as he had found it. Then he rode like the devil was after him to Westborough, where he met with Howard Pritchard, an ambitious lawyer with a flexible sense of right and wrong. Pritchard read the papers, and with each page his eyes grew wider. He knew right away what Marcus had brought him. It wasn't just proof of cruelty, which the courts would probably ignore. It was proof that he was crazy. The letters and journals showed a woman who was completely out of touch with reality and was having a violent, paranoid delusion. This was the most important thing. Georgia law says that a person who is mentally incompetent could lose their legal rights. The court would choose a guardian to take care of their business. The Willow Bend estate, which had thousands of acres and dozens of slaves, was one of the most valuable prizes in Burke County. Pritchard told Marcus how the plan would work. They still couldn't move. They had to wait. Let Cordelia keep going. Let her hang herself with her own rope. They needed more proof and more people to speak up. The situation had to get so bad that the court would have to step in. Marcus agreed, but his conscience, or maybe just his common sense, bothered him. He asked, "What about the men?" Pritchard waved his hand in a dismissive way and said, "They're dying." He said in a coldly practical way, their deaths would only make the case against her stronger. Their suffering was a necessary part of the legal strategy. Cordelia wasn't stupid. Yes, she was paranoid. She was paranoid, but she was also very alert. As soon as she got back to her room, she knew something was wrong. The floorboard had a small scratch on it that wasn't there before, and the way the box felt like it had been moved. It was an animal instinct, like that of an animal that knows its home has been broken into. She knew for sure who had done it. Marcus Delqua, the overseer. He had been looking at her and asking her questions. She didn't think he was that good. She thought that being the mistress of the plantation meant she couldn't be touched. She had forgotten that in the Old South, loyalty was a valuable thing, and a white man's ambition would always come before his duty to a woman, even his boss. She answered quickly, without saying a word, and with violence. That night, she called Marcus to the study. There was no yelling or blaming, just a cold final dismissal. The money he earned was on the desk. He had to leave Willow Bend by sunrise. If he ever said anything about what he thought he knew, or tried to use what he had stolen, she would use her family's power in Charleston to completely destroy him. She would make sure that every plantation in the South would not hire him. He would be done for. Without saying a word, Marcus took his money and left. He knew he had lost this first battle, but he had the weapons he needed for the war. He rode straight back to Pritchard's office, the stolen letters burning a hole in his saddlebag. The two men stayed up all night writing the first legal petitions. The net was starting to close in on Cordelia, but she was not an easy animal to catch. She was the kind of person who would chew off her own leg to get away, and she was about to get even more dangerous. Not the soft, delicate hands of a plantation lady, but Cordelia's hands are getting rough and chapped from the creek water, and the chemicals she handles every day. The tinctures left behind some light brown stains under her nails. They are the hands of a killer who is so focused on her work that she doesn't care about how she looks anymore. She carries them with her everywhere as proof. The firing of the overseer shocked everyone in Willow Bend. It showed that the brutal plantation hierarchy was unstable at the very top. Cordelia put a less powerful man in charge, but he didn't have the same authority as Marcus. The enslaved community started to push back in small, subtle ways as they felt a change in the power dynamic. Work slowed down, tools went missing, and a quiet, growing resistance started to form. Cordelia got more and more violent as she felt her control slipping away. The sound of the whip got louder. There were fewer rations. She was a queen holding on to a throne that was falling apart, and her answer was to tighten her grip and crush any sign of dissent. And the morning rituals went on through it all. They were her rock, her source of strength, and the only thing she still thought she could control. Isaiah Drummond died on July 28th. He didn't die by the creek. In the middle of the night, he died in his cabin. After months of abuse and poison, his body just gave up. His body finally gave up. Cordelia's response was scary because it showed no humanity. She told him to be buried right away in an unmarked grave with no ceremony. She wrote one short dismissive entry in the Plantation ledger. Isaiah, fever. His life, his skills, and his suffering were all summed up in 2 words. His death didn't make her stop and think. She didn't question her methods because of it. It did the opposite. It gave her strength. In her messed-up mind, his death was a sign that the treatment was working. He had completely passed on his life force. She had completely taken him in. She gave Caleb and Josiah twice as much medicine that night. She was determined to do something new. She would see this through to the end. The test was not finished. There was no way Margaret could take it anymore. She had seen her mother plan a murder in slow motion, lived in a house full of fear and unspoken horror, and now a man was dead. The terrible moral injury of what she was seeing finally broke her loyalty to her mother. She wrote a letter to her aunt, Catherine Vance, in Charleston, not to the local authorities who she knew would do nothing. Catherine was her mother's sister-in-law. She was a powerful woman from high society, but Margaret knew she was smart and caring. With shaking hands, Margaret told everything. Her mother's early morning walks, the scary changes in the 3 men, the strange chemical smells, and Isaiah's death. She wrote down all of her fear and confusion. She gave the sealed letter to a trusted house servant, one of the few people she thought her mother's craziness hadn't affected, and told them to mail it secretly from Westboro. That letter, a child's desperate cry for help, was like a lit fuse slowly moving toward the powder keg at Willow Bend. It would take 10 days to get to Charleston. During that time, Cordelia would continue her deadly work without knowing about this new betrayal. Margaret had no idea that her letter was about to join 2 other forces that were working against her mother. With the stolen documents in hand, Marcus Delqua and Howard Pritchard were putting the finishing touches on their legal petition in Westboro. Dr. Peaton, on the other hand, was getting ready to file his own formal complaint with the county sheriff, describing the strange symptoms of poisoning he had seen. At Willow Bend, the 3 lines of attack, familial, legal, and medical, were about to come together. Cordelia was a spider in the middle of a web she had made herself, but she was about to find out that there were other, bigger webs all around her. Dr. Peaton got to Willow Bend on August 20th, and his face was serious. He told Cordelia he was there to check on the family's health again, but she saw right through the lie. He made sure to check out Caleb Tucker and Josiah Mercer. Cordelia said no. They were her property, she said again, and it was her job to take care of them. But the doctor didn't back down. His voice was strong and confident. He said, He was there because her family in Charleston asked him to be there, which was a lie that was close to the truth. Cordelia took him to Caleb's cabin, but she didn't want to. What the doctor saw was like something out of a nightmare. Caleb was lying on a dirty straw pallet and hardly breathing. He was thin as a rail. His skin was covered in sores, and his gums and fingernails were a sickening blue-gray color. This is a clear sign of heavy metal poisoning. Dr. Peaton lost his cool. This wasn't a fever. This was torture. He looked at Josiah and saw the same terrible signs. He looked at Cordelia, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "By God's name, woman, what have you been giving them?" This was the first time Cordelia's mask of sanity fell off. She started to talk about Dr. Kensington's protocol, the important transfusion, and the therapeutic bathing and tinctures that were supposed to help her get better by taking advantage of their extra energy. Her voice was high and strained. Dr. Peaton listened, and with each word, his horror grew. He knew that the chemicals she named, like mercury, arsenic, and digitalis, were deadly poisons. He said in a low, angry voice, "You are not curing yourself. You are killing these men." Cordelia straightened up, and for a moment she was the same bossy person she used to be. "You don't understand," she said in a low, scary voice. "They deserved it. It was a correction, a balancing of the scales, and it is working. I have never felt more alive." Dr. Peaton ran away from Willowbend like he was running away from a plague house. He rode straight to the sheriff's office and made a formal report. His testimony was a damning account of poisoning, torture, and a mistress who went crazy and killed someone. His report, along with Howard Pritchard's legal petition that used Marcus's stolen letters as proof, made things worse. The authorities had to pay attention now. Sheriff Benjamin Talmadge and 2 deputies rode up the long, oak-lined drive to Willowbend on September 3, 1838. Not yet were they there to arrest her. It was hard to understand what the law said about what people could do with their own property. But they had a court order. For a short time, Cordelia Rutledge would not be able to control the plantation or her children. A group of doctors told her she had to take a mental competency test. Her Aunt Catherine Vance was already on her way from Charleston to be her temporary guardian. It was done. Cordelia stood on the grand veranda and watched the cops come. She knew it. She didn't yell or fight. She took the news in with the same strange calm she had shown at her husband's funeral. She had lost the match. But the sheriff's eyes weren't on him while he read the order. They were looking past him, at the fields, the slave quarters, and Turkey Creek. It was a look of deep, scary disappointment. Not because she felt bad about what she had done, but because her work had been interrupted. The experiment wasn't done yet. The cleaning was not done yet. At that moment, the whole world that had worked against her husband, the doctors, the lawyers, and even her own daughter became one evil thing in her mind. The competency hearing was just a formality. 3 doctors, one of whom was a very shaken Dr. Patton, questioned Cordelia for 4 hours in a stuffy room at the Westboro courthouse. She tried to look like she was thinking clearly. She talked about how her husband had betrayed her in a calm and logical way. She used scientific language she had learned from Kensington's letters to back up his ideas. She said that the fact that her health had gotten better was proof that the treatments worked. But her delusion was a fortress, and every question they asked was a new brick in its wall. When they asked her about the morality of what she had done, Isaiah's death, and the pain that Caleb and Josiah were going through, the facade fell apart. She didn't feel sorry or understand. She talked about the men like they were lab animals that had to die for a greater scientific and personal truth. The doctors quickly and unanimously agreed that Cordelia Rutledge had a serious delusional disorder, a paranoid mania that made her a threat to herself and others. They said she was legally insane. A week later, her aunt Catherine Vance came and took charge of the mess at Willow Bend. She was a practical, no-nonsense woman who was horrified by what she heard. She locked Cordelia in an upstairs bedroom, making her a prisoner in her own home. She stopped the rituals right away and got the 2 surviving men the medical care they needed, even though she had been told it was too late. Then Catherine started her own investigation because she wanted to know how this horrible thing had happened. She paid men to look for Victor Kensington in Charleston, but he was gone. There was no one in his office, and the trail was cold. It was like the puppet master had disappeared into thin air as soon as his puppet strings were cut. But Kensington had left a trail behind. Investigators found copies of his letters, not just to Cordelia, but also to the lawyer Howard Pritchard, in his empty office. The second plot was revealed. Catherine Vance took letters to court that showed Pritchard had been paying Kensington for information and had let the horror at Willow Bend get worse on purpose to make more money. The scandal was huge. Pritchard was kicked out of the bar and ran away from the state, a disgraced villain. Marcus Delqua, who had been a pawn in Pritchard's game, told the truth about everything he saw. His initial greed was replaced by the real horror of what he had found. The official story started to take shape. Cordelia was crazy, yes, but she was crazy because one con artist had expertly controlled her and another had heartlessly let her go. But Catherine still had one question. What had her brother-in-law, Thomas Rutledge, done? That was the question that had started it all. Was Cordelia's story of a big sexual lie just a lie that her broken mind made up? Or was there some truth at the heart of her madness? Catherine hired a private detective, a former Charleston police officer known for his discretion and determination, because she needed to know and fully understand the legacy her nieces and nephews had received. His job was to find out the hidden secrets of Thomas Rutledge. What he found was worse than anything Cordelia could have thought of. It was a truth that was so simple, so common in the system of slavery, and yet so deeply distorted that it changed everything. It explained the motive not as pure insanity, but as a horrible reaction to a horrible truth. The detective's investigation was like a slow, quiet digging up of secrets. He looked over old records from the plantation. He talked to the oldest slaves on the property, who had been there since before Cordelia came, and he found out the truth. Thomas Rutledge was not sterile at all. He had already had several children with enslaved women on his plantation before he married Cordelia. This was his secret. He kept these kids, who were his own mixed-race children that he didn't tell anyone about, at Willow Bend. He didn't give them away. He gave them special roles. He taught them useful skills. Isaiah was a carpenter, Caleb was a blacksmith, and Josiah was his personal servant. These were not random men. They were his sons. They were proof of his power and his hypocrisy that he could see and touch. He had brought his new wife, Cordelia, to a house where his secret family already lived. Cordelia was smart and observant. She noticed things that a wife would notice, like how much her own children, who were born years later, looked like these 3 favored slaves. The strange crescent-shaped birthmark that runs in the Rutledge family shows up on both of their kids. She had put together a version of the truth. She was right that her husband had lied to her. She was correct that her progeny were related to Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. But her conclusion, which came from being alone, paranoid, and feeling deeply violated, was wrong. The men had not been brought to her bed. They weren't used to getting her pregnant. The truth was much more personal and, in the context of Southern honor, much more disgusting. Her kids had half-brothers named Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. Thomas had made a family tree so full of lies and secrets that when his wife finally found out about it, she killed him. Take a moment to think about that. The whole ritual, the whole descent into madness and murder was a sick, wrong act of revenge. Cordelia thought she was punishing the people who hurt her, but she was really killing her husband's sons, who were also her stepsons. She was destroying the bloodline she thought she was cleaning up because of the cruel logic of slavery. This news changes everything. It doesn't make what she did right, but it puts it in the context of a betrayal so deep that it's hard to understand. She lived for years in a house with her husband's other family, where she had to deal with them and manage them. During that time, she began to suspect that she was part of some horrible lie. There was a reason for her insanity. It was a cancer that grew from a seed of truth that her husband had planted. The last part of the tragedy at Willow Bend happened very quickly. Caleb Tucker died on September 24, 1838, when his body finally gave out. The last of the three, Josiah Mercer, lived, but the man he had been was gone for good. The poisons had messed up his mind. He lived for 8 more years as a mindless, shuffling ghost, cared for by the other slaves. He was a living reminder of the horror that had taken over the plantation. He was always there, silently reminding the mistress of her madness and the master's secrets that had led to it. He died when he was 34 years old. The official cause was listed as natural causes, with no hint of irony. There was never a trial for Cordelia Rutledge. In Georgia, in 1838, a slave owner couldn't be charged with killing their own property. Catherine Vance, who was desperate to protect her young nieces and nephews from any more scandal, used her connections. The whole thing was quietly put away. Cordelia was quietly sent to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in November. She would live there for the next 14 years and die of pneumonia in 1852. The records from her time in the asylum say that she was quiet and withdrawn, and that she spent her days writing in journals that the staff would often take and burn. They said she never talked about Willow Bend. She never talked about the men she had killed. She just wrote and wrote, filling page after page with a story that no one else could read. Aunt Catherine raised her children in Charleston. They were told a heavily edited version of the story, that their mother had gotten very sick and sad after their father died. The place where the horror happened, Willow Bend, was sold. The house was gone by the time of the Civil War. Sherman's army burned it down, and the land was divided up. The name Willow Bend was no longer remembered. The tale turned into a ghost story that people told. People said that the bend in Turkey Creek was a scary place. They said that even in the summer, the water there was cold, and that if you listened closely on a quiet night, you could hear people chanting in a language that no one could understand. The truth was buried, but buried things have a way of coming back to the surface. At the end of the story, there is a scary, symbolic moment. Cordelia wrote her daughter Margaret one last letter from the asylum in 1846. A single page that survived the fires was found decades later. She doesn't ask for forgiveness or show that she feels bad in it. She writes, "I have learned that being angry gives you freedom. They can't touch you. You're no longer bound by their rules or truths. I gave them a story of violation and revenge that they could understand, a story that fit their small world. The real story is that I found a door out of that world and walked through it. I only wish I could have taken you with me." What do you think was worse? Cordelia's ritual murder or the lies her husband told her for the rest of her life that made her do it?